2.
So there's no more Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head. It's just Potato Head, which Hasbro has done in a move to be more gender inclusive. And meanwhile, the House has just passed a sweeping Equality Act. All this is good. It's a great week for the LGBTQ plus community. But are you transphobic if you actually think biological sex still matters? It's Rob Nelson Live. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Rob Nelson Live, coming at you from Los Angeles this week. And you guys are everywhere, all around the world, the globe. We're streaming on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Reddit, of course, and wanting to have your feedback and engagement with us as always. So let's dive right in. Today's all about transphobia, transgender rights and transphobia. So Mr. Potato Head, remember Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head? You know, that stuff existed when I was a kid, but then Toy Story made them really big. And they just this last week, Hasbro announced that they were no longer going to have Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head. Well, actually, they were, but they were going to rebrand the whole thing, calling it Potato Head. No more Mr. and Mrs. but just Potato Head. And their reasoning was, and we got a fun graphic of two, I think they're gay potato heads. Crafty, we got a picture of those guys? Maybe we don't. We had one. But the idea was to have a gender neutral design. And the reasoning behind a gender neutral design was that they essentially wanted to make sure everybody felt welcome. So you can take the potato heads and build your own kind of, you know, build whatever you want. Build a gender neutral potato head. Build a gay potato head. And essentially nothing wrong with that, except it really was probably just kind of a marketing ploy, right? The trans community was kind of like, huh? Like, how about you give us, you know, we got real issues. We got real problems going on, right? I mean, we have being denied things left, right, and center. So if only the world really was as easy as just rebranding the potato heads. Meanwhile, Oreo, in a move to be gender inclusive, literally tweeted to their 900,000 followers, Oreo cookies. The company tweeted, "Transpo exists." Okay. People were like, huh? And then Nilla Wafer, a brand of Oreo, tweeted back to Oreo, basically saying, you know, we respect you, we include you. And again, the transgender community was a little bit like, what? You know, okay, thank you. We got real problems. So it's funny, but it's not, because on the cancel culture side of things, it's sort of like, really, you're having, you know, you're making your potato heads gender inclusive now? Okay, I get it. It's fine. Kids can build whatever kind of family structures they want. But let's be honest, they're just trying to expand their market. I gotta be realistic. It's capitalism. They're like, we'll get more people to buy Potato Head if we do this. They're not really making a difference for trans people, as a lot of trans people pointed out. What could be making a difference for trans people is the Equality Act. And the Equality Act was passed this week. Crafty, we got a graphic of that?
Yep.
Also, I'm getting a little feedback here, Crafty. I don't know if you can kill that or not.
Yep, I'll be right there.
Just mute yourself, maybe. Okay. So the House passes sweeping Equality Act. The bill prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And the whole idea was essentially, you know, we provided civil rights. The Civil Rights Act provided equality against discrimination, right? For Black people, then for women. And you can't, you know, for religion, you can't discriminate. You can't discriminate in employment. You can't discriminate in housing. You can't discriminate in voting. You literally can't unfairly discriminate a person because of their class, because of their religion, because of their gender. Crafty's fixing the audio here. We're just having a few tech problems, guys. Bear with us. Okay, cool. And you know, on the surface of it, it makes total sense, right? I mean, here's just a couple statistics that kind of show you where things are at when it comes to discrimination. And by the way, 80% of people are in favor of not discriminating against trans people, which makes sense. And it's trans and gay people who would be protected under the Equality Act. 27 states right now deny housing to people based on their sexual orientation or their gender preference. 31 states deny certain kinds of education benefits. 41 states will deny you sitting on a jury. Seriously? 2021? We're denying you that because you're gay or because you're trans? It's ridiculous. And so the idea of an Equality Act to prohibit that, Crafty, I'm still getting that feedback. The idea of an act to prevent that makes enormous sense. Like, it's just like the logical thing. It's sort of sad that we need to do it, that we need to actually pass a law in order to fix that. But that's what, it's going to take. So fair enough. And I'm 100% in favor of the broad idea of extending that kind of equal protection under the law. That's what the Civil Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act was all about in the mid-60s. Provide those protections. To extend them to people based on sexual orientation, gender preference, makes 100% sense. Of course, it became a battle in Congress between some conservatives and some on the left. I'll show you two tweets. One tweet, Crafty, can I have the first tweet from Congressman Marie Newman? Congressman Marie Newman, who has a kid who has a transgender kid who's a teenager who came out, I think it was a boy, became a girl, and said, without the Equality Act, millions of Americans like my daughter can be denied housing, education, more simply because they identify as transgender. I'm voting to pass the Equality Act for my daughter, the strongest, bravest person I know. And again, think about it for a second. If you're trans, if you're a kid, and if you're anybody, and you're having gender identity, gender dysphoria, that's a real thing. And you're trying to figure it out, it's got to be lonely and scary and hard. I mean, it's hard enough to figure anything out if you're going through puberty as you're a young adult, much less feeling honestly like you don't identify with a gender. And I've known, I worked for a long time with a young person who was actually born what they call intersex, so with parts of both, and was raised as a boy, but identified as a girl and had a twin brother. And was raised as a boy, but deep down identified as a girl more than as a boy. And ultimately, made that switch all the way over. And it was a complicated, confusing journey that, along with incredible hatred. I mean, he was raised as a boy, so, but had girl parts and was in a shower in a gym and played on the boys' soccer team, but never let anyone see him with his clothes off. When the boys saw him, they raped him in the shower. It was horrible. So this is not an easy thing. I sympathize and empathize with anyone or any family going through it. So on the other side of the equation was your favorite, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the QAnon crazy conspiracist on the right, had this to say in a tweet about the Equality Act. As mothers, we all love and support our children, but your biological son does not belong in my daughter's bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports teams. Now, that blew up with enormous backlash that she's a transphobe, and she may be, and she did that tweet intending to boom, your biological son. And I'm going to get to this issue in a couple minutes about the role of biology and gender, right? The biological sex versus the gender we choose, and how that plays out in things like sports and all that. But the Equality Act nonetheless passed, not before this little moment happened. Just watch these two little tweets that Congressman Newman and then Congressman Marjorie Taylor put up in support of their positions. They're literally across the hall from each other in Congress, their offices. Check these out. Gender flag so people could look at it. So immediately across the hall, Marjorie Taylor Greene puts up her own thing, sort of in a tit for tat response. Male and female, trust the science. So they're across the hall from each other doing their little tit for tat game. And I get it. And maybe it's funny and whatever. And maybe it's good that you can have some kind of civil discourse and disagreement in that way. But the underlying issue of this is what is actually real. It's not It's not a fake issue. And it comes up in a number of ways. So I'm going to hit the 3 ways that I think it really shows up the most, right? Again, I want to be clear. The idea of providing legal equality across the board for trans people is essential and important and long past due. And there shouldn't be workplace discrimination in housing, juries, any of it, none of it. The reality is there is always going to be some social discrimination because that's what people do. And my concern in this is that as we weave down the kind of the woke road on this, yeah, I agree with you that you can't discriminate. And I want to get to your second part of your comment, Fort Walton Bleach, in a minute. This is where it gets trickier, right? So the issue becomes when a person wants to transition, right? You're a teenager. Think about it. You're going through all kinds of crazy stuff, and you're trying to decide, am I comfortable in my gender? And one of the issues that has come up is whether or not teenagers should be able to decide to have sex changes. And the secondary issue is whether their parents can have to consent. And a big, strong argument is the parents don't get to consent. So while there was a hearing in which a woman was being nominated to be the Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services in this area, and she's the first she'd be the first transgender cabinet appointee, is being grilled by conservative Senator Rand Paul, and this is what he asks her.
Do you support the government intervening to override the parent's consent to give a child puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and/or amputation surgery of breasts and genitalia? You have said that you're willing to accelerate the protocols for street kids. I'm alarmed that poor kids with no parents who are homeless and distraught, you would just go through this and allow that to happen to a minor. I would hope that you would have compassion for Kira Bell, who's a 23-year-old girl.
All right, Crafty,
who was
we can
confused
cut
with her
that.
identity.
That's enough of that.
At 14,
we didn't
she
get the right cut there, guys. Sorry. So basically, he asked her that question, and she answers that question, basically refusing to answer it, which is why I was showing you guys the clip. Sorry, we're having all kinds of tech problems, you guys. I apologize. And my point is this. She doesn't go, no, I think parents shouldn't consent. She basically gives him the answer she gives him the whole time, which is it's a complex field. I'm happy to talk about it. And he says, let the record show she doesn't answer the question. That's a valid question. Do you want to let kids make a sex change? Some conservatives doesn't equal all conservatives, monkey arms. And I don't think this is an inherently conservative argument. I mean, I am as pro-trans as you can get. And I've talked to a lot of trans people, and I've interviewed a lot of trans people. And, the real issues they face. I interviewed a Black trans woman who talked about the difficulty of being accepted both in the gay community and in the Black community because, she'd been a guy transitioned to a woman. And the struggle she faced just being accepted within those two communities alone. I mean, the amount of discrimination you face is inordinate. And it's a real issue. But so is the issue of whether or not you want someone who's a kid to be making those choices for themselves. Those are irreversible choices. That's just on the medical end of having genital surgery to remove your genitals or remove your breast, or massive hormone treatments, which, as I said, I worked closely with someone for years who had to have those. And it was, it's a long-term effects. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm saying it's a difficult decision. And if you're going to make it, your parents should be part of that decision, in my mind. But I think it goes beyond even that. I mean, the issue to me really gets into some sort of fun and complicated social issues. And the idea, let's move to sports, right? I mean, think of it this way, right? If we've essentially are replacing biological sex as defining gender as defining who you are with a gender preference. And that's where this gets complicated, right? I mean, Demi Lovato tweeted recently that you can't, gender reveal parties are transphobic. If you're going to pick your gender and announce it, you're transphobic. And that's the problem, right? How can a gender reveal party be transphobic? We have two genders biologically. You can't argue that. I mean, some scientists do in a very complex, convoluted way, try to argue that gender's fluid even biologically. But just the basic facts, our species exists because we have biological men and biological women. They come together and make babies. Without that, you've got no species. So to argue sex, biology, and sex doesn't dictate gender is ridiculous. It doesn't mean you can't change your gender. It doesn't mean you can't have a different gender preference and can't choose to live your life with that different gender preference. That's totally reasonable. But that's different than arguing at the same time you can't actually say there's biological gender. You can't have it both ways. You can't have no biological gender, everything's just fluid, and say you're following the science when the science clearly is there is biological gender. Sex is a determinant in our lives. And we all do identify. The whole notion I don't identify as a man, I identify as a woman is that very thing. I want to change my gender. I want to change my biology even through surgery to represent the other sex. So on one hand, yes, you can have gender preference and you can choose what gender you want to be. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. 100% nothing wrong with that. Live the life and the identity you feel most comfortable with. I truly believe there are people who are born a boy or born a girl and don't identify with it at all. And they want to be the other gender. But that doesn't mean you're transphobic because you then say there still are two biological genders. And those have real consequences and repercussions. Sports is a great place where that shows up. In 2017, this kind of erupted when, and I pop up a picture here, Grafty, of these two trans athletes. The girl on the left, you got that picture, Grafty? Yeah. The girl on the left was a boy and transitioned to a girl, Andrea Yearwood. And on the right is Terry Miller, also a boy transitioned as a girl. And in 2017, in Connecticut, the high school championships, Andrea Yearwood beat everybody at the 100 and 200 meter run. Thanks, Crafty. At the 200, yeah, thanks, Crafty. At the 200 meter run, and basically would have been a second behind the last place in the boys' state championship, but was way ahead of all the girls because it was born a biological male. And the girl who won the year before said basically, it's frustrating. She said, it's just how it is. I can't say what I really think. That's the problem. She couldn't say, I really think it's not okay, but she didn't think it was okay. And when you stop and think about it for a second, cut to 3 years later, and lawsuits have happened, all that, Yearwood and Terry Miller become first and second in the Connecticut state championships. Both biological boys who transition to girls. No one can beat them. And people go, you're being a transphobe. I'm not. It's a biological reality that men's bodies develop differently. We have denser bones, bigger muscle mass. There's a reason why the best WNBA players can't win in the NBA. It's not because they're not great athletes. Biologically, they're not built the same as men. And when you put biological boys who transition to girls and not necessarily had hormone therapy into women's sports, there's no girl in their class who's going to beat them. Girls can beat boys, but if in your own class, you won't. It doesn't matter what sport you're in, swimming, tennis, football, basketball, track. So to suggest that it's okay to let boys compete as girls, biological boys who transition to girls, you're knocking any of the top girls out. They'll never compete above them. The science shows that. It's one example. And is it fair? Is it fair? And again, it gets under the whole issue of the Title IX equality, the Title IX education funds and all that, based on the fact that if you can't discriminate, you can't discriminate there either. But how fair is that to girls? And when you get to the whole issue of even bathrooms, and I don't think the bathroom issue is as much as some people do, going into a girl's bathroom, if you're a guy, but there are real women who have concerns about having biological males come into their showers just because they identify as a girl. And to go, no, none of that matters. Why have men's and women's sports if we're going to say gender is not really, it's just 100% fluid. There is no actual biological basis for it. Why have men's and women's sports? Why have men's and women's anything? Why distinguish between men and women at all in that context? The irony is that the whole notion of a person having a gender transition is they identify with a different gender. And again, gender identification is fine. But to deny the biology underneath it, which even they're in a sense not doing because they're having a biological change. They're having a penis replaced with a vagina. They're removing their breasts. They're biologically adopting what the other biological sex has. But yet you can't say there's a biological difference or you're transphobic. And that's what I don't like. You're not transphobic because you say that. This actually all blew up a few years back with with J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author. And it started with this tweet, with 2 tweets in a row. Let me read them for you. If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. And then she said, the idea that women like me who've been empathetic to trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way as women, i.e. to male violence, hate trans people. The idea that they hate trans people because they think sex is real and have lived consequences is a nonsense. So that blew up with her being a transphobe. Now, here's the point that I would say about that. I don't know if she is or isn't a transphobe, but she, like many women, and many women on the left align with this, the progressive left feminist movement, that the idea that you are, the idea that, monkey arms, I'm going to address that in 1 minute, that this affects 0.1% of today's problems. And I disagree with you. I suspected someone might say that. So let me say why it doesn't. This is not just an arbitrary cultural thing. It has very real consequences. First of all things are personal, right? So it does have consequences for anybody who's living in that space. So it's sort of like to say, there are, J.K. Rowling's experience as a domestic abuse survivor. If you're a survivor of that matters to you. But more importantly, when you erase when you try to say there's no difference between a transgender and a biological woman, you have essentially erased the biological distinction of a woman as a protected class. And that has consequences across the board. We went a long way to protect women as a class, as a biological class, in all kinds of ways that are important. So when you erase that biological distinction, you are putting them at risk. So to Monkey Arms, to your point, what does this have to do with problems in today's world? Well, again, beyond the fact that it has to do with anybody who's living any of these experiences, anybody who's living a gender identity experience, anybody who's discriminated based on that, anybody who identifies strongly as a biological woman and has dealt with domestic trauma. Maybe you're living in a shelter and don't want biological men in the shelter with you. Those are real people, Monkey Arms. But beyond that, it has a huge distinction. A huge importance, I'm saying, that distinction, because part of what's happening in our solving of real world problems, as you put it, Monkey Arms, is we are putting everything into a box, into this preconceived box, this critical race theory type box that defines how we look at so many social and political issues. So the Equality Act affects a lot of people and a lot of things, and the transgender issue and how we're dealing with it. The notion that if you believe biological sex is real, if you say men are men and women are women, and sure, if you want to go ahead and change, you can, but those two foundations still exist, that you will essentially be considered acting in hate speech, has a precedent for how we look at all kinds of things going forward. True, it doesn't immediately affect something as in terms of, say, poverty, but here's how it does. Because we could be putting the focus into serving people who are in need based on class, not based on gender or gender identity. There are real problems facing impoverished communities. And those real problems need addressing. They need financial infusions. They need better schools. They need better healthcare, better hospitals. Those are real problems, Monkey Arms. Those are real needs. Those don't get addressed directly because we've said essentially you can't have class as a framework for deciding things. It has to be based on this critical race theory of gender identity, and again, I'm not going to have time to dive into the critical race theory mindset, but that's what's created so much of the woke extremism in how we look at things. So how does it affect real world problems? Well, it takes the train off the track to where we don't even focus on how to deal with those problems. So on the one hand, I'd agree with you, Monkey Arms. The real issues we need to address aren't being addressed. But these issues are consuming tons of time and energy, and not just because I'm spending 25 minutes on it. We just had a huge debate in Congress. The Equality Act was a huge battle. The trans issue is exploding, and corporations are making decisions, around these issues at a massive level. So it does have an impact. It has a real impact. It has a real impact on the actual policies and the focus of where energy goes. It also has an impact on silencing and curtailing discussion and free thought. And that has an impact, Monkey Arms, on all kinds of problems. I mean, there was a book, When Harry Became Sally, that got taken off Amazon. And it's a book that's actually very fair and balanced. It has a view that, but it's not meant to be a right-wing manifesto by any means. But it got taken down because it wiped So you say, what does that matter? That's not to me just an abstract thing, cancel culture. It's removing the room we have to have a debate, an honest and open debate around issues. And that has impact and ramifications on every single policy and every single major area of policy and social and political and economic change that we all face. On Friday, I'm going to dive back into politics for issues that people like Monkey Arms think are more relevant. But for today, I don't want you to leave this thinking this is a sidebar issue, because it's not. It's not sidebar to the many, many, many people across the country and the world who are affected by it on either side, and particularly those who are struggling with gender identity. And it's not a sidebar when our entire nation and policymaking structure is starting to focus on making decisions and following an agenda and a path that's guided by kind of a critical race theory and elitist intellectual theory about identity, rather than looking at a more basic framework that would allow us to look at things, say, as I said, in terms of class, and identify and address real problems on the ground that affect wide classes of people, not abstract gender neutral norms. I'm Rob Nelson. Thanks for watching.